It happened in broad daylight, in the middle of the village square, where children played and elders gathered to exchange soft conversations. A single act shattered the rhythm of ordinary life. The Imam, tall, stern, his voice always carrying authority, walked deliberately toward the Virgin Mary statue that had stood there for generations. For decades, it had been the quiet centerpiece of the town, weathered, grey stone, hands folded in prayer, her gaze lowered in sorrowful compassion. But that day, he did not look at her as a mother, a comfort, or even a work of art. He looked at her as nothing. With a dismissive grunt, he wrapped his hands around the statue's base, gritted his teeth, and with the help of a few younger men, lifted it up. Murmurs rose around him, confused at first, then alarmed. No one quite believed what they were seeing until the Imam barked words that cut through the square like a knife. "Enough of this idolatry. This is nothing but stone and superstition." Gasps. A woman clutched her chest. An elderly man dropped the rosary in his hand, its beads scattering against the cobblestones. Children stopped in their tracks, their laughter silenced, eyes wide. And then came the moment no one expected. Without hesitation, the Imam carried the Virgin Mary statue across the square, step by step, his sandals scraping against the stones until he reached the edge where a large metal dumpster sat, half filled with broken planks and discarded furniture. With a hard, echoing clang, he heaved the statue in and let it fall among the trash. The sound was louder than it should have been, stone against metal, like a bell tolling in the wrong place at the wrong time. The square froze. For a breathless moment, no one moved. The Imam dusted his hands off as though he had rid himself of some burden. His face was proud, almost defiant. He turned to the gathering crowd, voice raised. "You pray to a carving. You kneel to nothing. There is only one God, and he does not live in stone." His words bounced off the walls of the nearby houses, off the shuttered windows and cracked wooden doors. Some villagers averted their eyes, unwilling to confront him. Others stood rooted, anger simmering but restrained by fear, because this wasn't just about a block of stone. For them, that statue had been more than material. Mothers had lit candles at her feet when their children fell sick. Widows had whispered prayers before her when loneliness pressed too heavy. Farmers, returning from barren fields, had left offerings of flowers, pleading for rain. She had been a silent witness to their suffering, their hope, their fragile belief that heaven still heard them. And now she was gone. Tears welled in the eyes of a grey-haired widow named Marta, who had for 20 years kept the base of the statue swept clean and always placed the first candle at dusk. She pressed her trembling hand against her lips, her voice barely a whisper, but heavy enough to carry, "Mother of mercy, forgive him. He knows not what he does." Some of the younger men clenched their fists. One took a step forward, ready to challenge the Imam, but an elder pulled him back. The air was thick, fragile, as though the entire town was holding its breath. The Imam, seeing their silence, mistook it for submission. He raised his chin higher, his words sharp, filled with pride. "Your faith is misplaced. You bow to stone and think it listens. I have freed you from foolishness today." But even as he spoke, unease, rippled through the crowd. Not anger alone, but fear, because deep in their bones, they felt something had been disturbed, something sacred torn from its rightful place. One of the children, a boy no older than 7, tugged at his mother's skirt and whispered, "Why did he throw her away? She never hurt anyone." His mother held him close, unable to answer. Marta, still clutching her rosary, whispered again, louder this time, "She won't be silenced. Not by him. Not by anyone." The Imam heard her. His lips curled into a smirk. He waved his hand dismissively, turned his back to the crowd, and walked away as if the matter was finished. To him, it was over. The statue was gone. The idolatry discarded like broken wood. But to the townspeople, it was not finished. The clang of stone against metal still rang in their ears, like an echo that refused to die. Their eyes remained fixed on the dumpster at the edge of the square. Some expected or perhaps feared that the statue would be shattered, broken into pieces. Yet strangely, the Virgin Mary's form remained whole, her folded hands still intact, her gaze still downward, untouched by the fall. No cracks, no chips, no broken pieces. And that was the beginning. Because what happened next, no one could explain, not even him. The clang of the statue hitting the dumpster echoed long after the Imam's footsteps faded. By nightfall, the square was buzzing with whispers, every doorway and kitchen carrying fragments of the same story. He threw her away with his own hands. Blasphemy like that never goes unanswered. Maybe it's better this way. After all, it's just stone. The village was split, as if the act had cut them in two. For the devout, it was unthinkable. The Virgin Mary had been a constant presence in their lives. They couldn't recall a time when she hadn't stood quietly in the square, bearing witness to weddings, funerals, and festivals. To them, she was not mere stone. She was the silent mother, listening when no one else would. The idea of her being tossed away like garbage struck them not just as sacrilege, but as a wound in the heart of the village itself. But for others, the Imam's words carried weight. These were the practical-minded, those who had drifted from faith long ago, beaten down by the hardships of life. They muttered in agreement, "He's right. It's just a statue, nothing more. Maybe now we can stop clinging to old superstitions." Yet even they spoke in lowered voices, as if afraid that saying it too loudly might invite something they could not name. At the center of it all was Marta, the widow. Her husband had died 10 winters ago. Her children long since moved to the city. She lived in a small stone house at the edge of the village, alone, save for the statue she had cared for daily. Every morning, she swept the cobblestones around its base. Every evening, she lit a candle, even when her hands shook too much to strike the match easily. For her, the Virgin Mary was not stone. She was company. She was comfort. She was the mother who had listened through nights of grief and silence. Now, Marta walked slowly to the dumpster, where the statue lay discarded. The crowd followed at a distance, too uneasy to step closer, yet unable to stay away. Marta pressed her frail hand against the rusted metal and whispered through trembling lips, her voice thin but steady, "She won't be silenced. Not by him, not by anyone." The words carried soft but sharp, and the villagers heard them. Some bowed their heads in agreement. Others turned away, uncomfortable, but no one laughed. The Imam, however, did. By the next day, he was triumphant. He walked through the marketplace with a prideful stride, greeting those who avoided his eyes as though he had won a battle. In the tea house, he retold the moment with exaggerated flair, mimicking the sound of stone hitting metal, roaring with laughter as if he had slain a dragon. "Do you see?" he declared to anyone who would listen. "You prayed to her for years. And yet, where is she now? In the trash, where superstition belongs." Some nodded, unsure whether out of agreement or fear of his authority. Others sat silently, sipping their tea, unwilling to challenge him, but unable to endorse him either. What unsettled them most wasn't his action, but the brazenness with which he mocked. He no longer limited himself to the statue. He ridiculed the candles Marta lit, the rosaries in elderly hands, the whispered prayers of mothers. Nothing was sacred to him anymore, and yet behind closed doors, whispers multiplied. He'll bring misfortune on us all. Mocking her is mocking a mother's heart. That never ends well. You'll see. Something will come of this. At night, shadows gathered around the square. Villagers crept out silently, some to look at the dumpster, others to kneel and pray in the dark. They found the statue lying awkwardly among the trash, but untouched. No cracks, no breaks, no missing pieces. Even in her discarded place, her folded hands and downcast eyes seemed almost alive, enduring. And Marta never left her side. Each evening, she lit a candle at the base of the dumpster, her frail frame barely visible in the darkness. When others warned her it was dangerous, that the Imam would be furious if he saw, she shook her head gently. Let him rage, she said. She is still here, and she is still listening. Her small act of defiance gave courage to others. Some nights, 1 or 2 candles flickered beside hers, then 3, then 5. Soon, the dumpster was surrounded by a quiet circle of light, fragile flames against the night, but steady. The Imam noticed, of course. His anger only grew. Fools, he spat in the marketplace, praying to trash. Kneeling before garbage, he laughed louder, mocked harder, daring anyone to stand against him. But the more he mocked, the more his laughter rang hollow. For every insult he threw, there was Marta's whispered prayer, candles burning through the night, and villagers who began to feel a quiet defiance stirring in their hearts. The town was divided, yes, but beneath the division, something else was rising. Tension, unease, and the gnawing sense that this was not over. Because in the silence after the Imam's laughter, people remembered Marta's words. She won't be silenced. Not by him, not by anyone. And even those who doubted found themselves glancing toward the dumpster at night, wondering if stone really was just stone. Because if it wasn't, then something had been disturbed. And sooner or later, something would answer. The first sign came quietly, almost too small to notice. At dawn, the grocer's boy, Matteo, arrived in the square to set up his stall. The air was still, the trees motionless, not a whisper of wind in the morning light. And yet, the heavy metal dumpster, rusted and rooted for years in its corner, was toppled on its side. Trash scattered across the cobblestones like a storm had swept through in the night. But there had been no storm, no rain, no thunder, no gale. And in the midst of the debris, the Virgin Mary statue lay upright, untouched, leaning gently against the side of the fallen container, as if she had been carefully placed there by unseen hands. Not a crack in the stone, not a smear of dirt. Matteo froze, his basket of apples clutched in his arms. The square was empty, but he could feel it, the stillness of something unusual. He backed away slowly, eyes never leaving the statue, before running to tell his mother. By mid-morning, the whispers had begun again. The dumpster fell, but not the statue. No wind, no reason, and yet there she is. Maybe Marta was right. Maybe she won't be silenced. That night, more signs appeared. Children playing near the square returned home breathless, swearing they had seen light, a faint glow, surrounding the discarded statue. Their parents dismissed it as imagination at first, the fanciful visions of young eyes. But when one child described the glow as like a candle, but brighter, like it came from her hands, silence fell heavy in the room. And when the children pointed to their eyes and said, "We couldn't look too long. It was too bright," even the doubters found their throats dry. Still, no one dared speak too openly. The Imam's shadow loomed large. When he heard of these rumors, the Imam laughed louder than ever. Glowing stone, toppled dumpsters, children's stories, and old women's fears. He scoffed in the tea house. This is how weak faith invents miracles, from accidents and dreams. Open your eyes. It's superstition, nothing more. But though he laughed, his hands tightened around his cup. Because he too had seen the dumpster that morning, toppled in silence, the statue unbroken and strangely clean. He had walked past quickly, refusing to look too closely. He told himself it was coincidence, gravity, a rat, anything but more. Yet in the corner of his mind, Marta's whisper lingered. She won't be silenced. Meanwhile, Marta herself continued her nightly vigil. Each evening, she shuffled to the square with a candle, kneeling before the discarded statue. She pressed her lips to her rosary and prayed not for vengeance, not even for justice, but for mercy. For him, she whispered, glancing toward the Imam's house. For us all. And it was on one such night that others began to join her. A mother who had lost her child years ago. A farmer whose crops had withered in the drought. A young couple desperate for work. They knelt beside Marta in silence, their faces lit by trembling flames. Soon, the dumpster was ringed with light, fragile, human-made, but steady against the dark, and those who passed by swore that for just a moment the stone itself glowed brighter than the candles. The Imam grew restless. He avoided the square at night now, muttering about fools wasting their time. Yet when he tried to sleep, dreams disturbed him. He saw the statue standing in the square, not discarded, but radiant, her eyes alive, her hands reaching toward him. He woke drenched in sweat, shaking his head violently. Dreams are nothing. Only the weak give them power. But even in the daylight, his certainty faltered. Once, walking through the marketplace, he caught sight of the statue in the distance. For the briefest second, he thought he saw her eyes lift. Not stone anymore, but seeing. He blinked, and she was, as before, unmoving. Still, the vision lingered like a thorn under skin. The village grew more tense with every passing day. Those who believed the signs gathered at night in reverent silence. Those who doubted muttered during the day, calling it hysteria, but their voices shook with unease. Even they avoided the square after sundown, and so the questions spread quietly from home to home, from ear to ear. How long can you ignore what your own eyes are telling you? Even the Imam, pacing his home in sleepless hours, could not escape it. But instead of softening, he grew harder. If they want signs, he declared to himself, I will give them proof that it is nothing. He would stage another mockery, louder and crueler than before, so that even the most stubborn would have no choice but to see it his way. He would end this once and for all. Yet deep inside, where no one could see, a tremor unsettled his resolve. Because he knew the truth, he could not admit. His eyes had already seen more than he wanted to believe. And whatever was coming next, he could feel it, like the gathering of a storm. The dream came suddenly, as vivid as if it were real. The Imam found himself standing in the square, under a heavy, starless sky. The cobblestones glistened like wet glass, though no rain had fallen. Before him stood the statue of the Virgin Mary, no longer discarded, no longer dulled by time. She radiated light, not blinding, not harsh, but soft, like a lantern held close in the dark. Her face was not stern, nor wrathful. It was sorrowful, and her eyes looked directly into him. He opened his mouth to shout, to mock, to call her only stone, but no sound came out. His throat tightened. His tongue felt heavy. Then, in the quiet that pressed around him, she spoke, not with lips that moved, but with a voice that filled the space between his thoughts. Why do you throw away what only wants to lift you up? The words cut through him like a blade. They were not angry. They were not condemning. They were sorrowful, almost pleading. He staggered back. His hands lifted instinctively as if to shield himself from her gaze. But the excuses, the arguments, the clever words he had used so often vanished from his mind. All that remained was silence, her silence, and it was unbearable. He fell to his knees in the dream, pressing his hands to his ears, but the words echoed deeper inside him. Why do you wound what only wants to heal? The Imam jolted awake, his body drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as though he had run for miles. His eyes darted around the room, the walls, the window, the rug beneath him. Normal, all normal, except for the clock. It glowed faintly in the dark, 3:33 a.m. He sat upright for a long time, heart hammering, trying to slow his breath. It was only a dream, he told himself. Only a dream. Dreams mean nothing. They are shadows of the mind, nothing more. But no matter how many times he whispered it, the words lingered. Why do you throw away what only wants to lift you up? The following night, the square was alive again. It began with Marta, as always. The widow shuffled to the dumpster, carrying her candle. She set it before the statue with trembling hands and whispered her rosary, her lips moving softly in the cool air. Then came the farmer, shoulders broad from years of toil, clutching a lantern. He knelt beside her without a word. Then came the mother who had lost her child. Then the young couple with their last loaf of bread. Then the children who had seen the glow. One by one they gathered until the dumpster, once a place of shame and mockery, was surrounded by light. Dozens of small flames flickered, reflecting off the cobblestones, making the square seem alive. They did not chant, they did not shout, they only knelt in silence, their eyes fixed on the Virgin Mary's face, their prayers rising like smoke into the night. From the shadows, others watched. Some skeptical, arms crossed, muttering about superstition. Others curious, drawn by the sight of so many gathered without anger, without fear. Even the doubters could not deny it. The air around the square felt different, heavy with something unsaid, and in a window nearby, the Imam watched too. He gripped the sill with both hands, knuckles white, as the candles burned, and the faces of his people glowed with faith. His chest tightened with something he could not name, anger perhaps, or envy, or fear. Fools, he whispered to himself, blind fools. Yet even as he spoke, his heart betrayed him, because the dream still clung to him, because her words still echoed in his mind, because no matter how he tried to explain it away, he had felt her presence, and it haunted him. That night, he tried to sleep again. He pulled the blanket over his head, shut his eyes, clenched his fists. But sleep brought no peace, only flashes of the statue, the sorrow in her eyes, the soundless voice asking why he had chosen to wound what heals. He woke again, trembling, his mouth dry. The clock glowed once more. 3:33 a.m. This time, when he looked out his window, he froze. The square lay still, empty now of villagers, the candles long extinguished. And yet the statue, discarded beside the toppled dumpster, seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. Not bright, not blazing, but steady, as though lit from within. The Imam blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Still glowing. He staggered back from the window, clutching his chest. No, no, this is madness. A trick of the eyes, nothing more. But his voice shook, and for the first time in years, he felt a cold he could not explain settle deep in his bones. The next morning, the villagers awoke to new whispers. "Did you see it?" one child asked another. "It glowed again," the farmer murmured to his wife. "She's not leaving us," Marta said softly, her voice full of quiet certainty. And though no one had proof, though no one dared shout it aloud, everyone knew something was happening, something none of them could dismiss, something even the Imam could not silence. But if the dream and the glow unsettled him, what came next would break him entirely, because signs can be dismissed, but encounters cannot. The day began like any other, but by late afternoon the sky changed. Dark clouds gathered without warning, rolling over the mountains faster than anyone in the village could remember. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of rain and something sharper, ozone, like fire waiting to be born. Mothers hurried children inside. Shopkeepers pulled their shutters tight. Farmers abandoned their fields, casting anxious glances toward the horizon. By dusk, the square stood deserted, save for Marta and her candle. She knelt beside the discarded statue, as she always did, her frail body bent forward, whispering prayers that rose with the growing wind. And then the storm broke. Rain lashed down in sheets, drumming against rooftops, slamming into the cobblestones until the square became a mirror of water. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder so violent it shook windows in their frames. But through it all, the candle at Marta's side burned. Tiny, fragile, but unyielding. The Imam stood at his doorway, robes clutched around him, eyes fixed on the scene. He told himself it was just weather, nothing more. But when the lightning flashed again, he saw it clearly. The Virgin Mary's statue, lying discarded, yet untouched. Rain poured over her stone face, yet she looked not broken, not diminished, only steadfast. And then came the fire. It started with a bolt of lightning, striking the edge of the square. A cart, piled with old hay, erupted in flames, orange tongues devouring it instantly. The wind carried sparks across the square, leaping from cart to stall, from stall to the awning of the bakery. The townspeople rushed into the streets, shouting, forming a line with buckets, their feet splashing in the rising water. Panic rippled through the air as fire and rain battled in the same breath. And yet, in the very heart of it all, the Virgin Mary remained. The flames reached the dumpster, licking at its sides, sparks flying high. But the statue, lying against it, was untouched. Not a scorch mark, not a crack. The fire swirled around her as though it had been commanded to pass her by. The Imam's knees trembled. He stumbled forward into the rain, his sandals slipping on the wet stone. He had to see it closer, had to prove to himself that it was an illusion, that the storm and the fire were nothing but chance. But the closer he came, the more undeniable it became. Flames leapt at wooden stalls, consuming them, but broke apart like water against stone when they neared her. Sparks died mid-air. Smoke curled around her, but never touched her robe. And still, Marta knelt beside her, her candle flickering, impossibly burning against the wind and storm. The Imam stopped just short of her, his chest heaving, his face pale. This is madness, he muttered, though his words carried no conviction. It's not possible. A crack of thunder answered him. Another bolt split the sky, striking so close that the ground beneath his feet shook. The crowd gasped, water streaming down their faces as they turned toward him. And then it happened. The Virgin's stone eyes seemed to catch the lightning, not move, not change, but reflect something greater, something living. The Imam felt it pierce him like a blade, cutting through pride, through arrogance, through the walls he had built around his heart. The weight was too much. His legs gave way. He collapsed to his knees in the flooded square, water soaking his robes, his hands pressing against the cold stone. The villagers froze. Buckets clattered to the ground. Silence fell heavier than the storm itself. The man who had mocked their faith, who had thrown their mother into the trash, now knelt before her, trembling like a child. The Imam lifted his face to the rain, his lips quivering, his voice raw and broken. Mercy. No sermon, no defiance, only that single word torn from his chest. Marta looked at him through the storm, her own tears mingling with the rain. She did not gloat, did not scold. She only placed her trembling hand on the wet cobblestones and whispered, "She listens." The flames began to die as quickly as they had risen. Buckets of water suddenly proved enough, the storm itself seeming to shift, rain falling heavier where fire had burned. Within minutes, the danger was over. The carts were destroyed, stalls blackened, but the square still stood. And in the center of it all, the Virgin Mary's statue remained, whole, untouched, her folded hands glistening with raindrops like pearls. The Imam stayed on his knees long after the storm passed, long after the villagers had gathered around in awed silence. His body shook, his pride shattered. The man who once mocked with laughter could not lift his eyes, and no one who saw it would ever forget, because it was not the fire or the storm that silenced him. It was her. But storms and fire were only the beginning. What followed was not destruction, but transformation, the kind that can turn even the hardest heart into one that finally kneels. The morning after the storm, the village square lay heavy with silence. Charred wood littered the streets, carts reduced to blackened frames, stalls nothing more than smoldering ash. But in the center of it all, against the toppled dumpster, the Virgin Mary's statue stood unharmed. Her folded hands were wet with rain, her face streaked with rivulets of water that looked almost like tears, but she was whole. The villagers gathered slowly, unsure of what to expect. Some came to survey the damage, others to see if what they had witnessed in the storm was truly real. Mothers held their children close. Men removed their hats. Marta, frail but steady, pressed forward until she was kneeling once more at the base of the statue, lighting another candle despite the morning light. And then, to everyone's astonishment, the Imam appeared. His robe was still damp from the night before, his face pale, his eyes hollowed by a sleepless night. He walked with no pride, no arrogance, only the slow, deliberate steps of a man carrying something heavy inside him. No one spoke as he approached. Whispers stilled. Buckets, brooms, and tools were set aside. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. He stopped before the statue and looked down at her, the same figure he had lifted and thrown away, the same stone he had called superstition. His lips trembled, his hands shook, and then, with a deep breath, he bent low, wrapping his arms around the base of the Virgin Mary and lifting. Gasps rose from the crowd. It was not an easy task. The stone was heavy, his body weary, his strength failing. But he did not stop. Step by step, staggering slightly, he carried the statue back across the square. The very same path he had walked days before in mockery, he now retraced in silence. The villagers followed behind him, wide-eyed, murmuring prayers. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Marta whispered through tears, "She's coming home." At last, he reached the pedestal where she had once stood. The base was still there, scorched by fire, blackened by smoke, but strong. The Imam lowered the statue carefully onto it, his body trembling, his breath ragged. And when he finally stepped back, the Virgin Mary stood again in her rightful place. Not discarded, not mocked, but restored. No one cheered, no one shouted. Instead, silence swept over the square, a reverent, heavy silence. Some wept quietly, others crossed themselves. Children knelt instinctively. The moment was too sacred for noise. The Imam sank to his knees before the statue, rainwater and ash soaking into his robes. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "I was blind. I was proud. Forgive me." Marta stepped forward, her candle flickering at the base. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "She listens," she said softly, "even when we don't deserve it." Tears streamed down his face. The man who once mocked, who laughed, who dared to throw away their mother's likeness, now knelt in humility, his pride broken. The villagers watched in awe, and something shifted inside them. Not just relief, not just vindication, something deeper. They saw what mercy could do, not punish, not destroy, but transform. Even the hardest heart could bend. Even mockery could be met with grace. In the days that followed, the square changed. The pedestal was repaired, its charred edges smoothed by careful hands. Fresh flowers lined its base. Candles flickered, morning and night. The statue, though weathered, looked more radiant than ever, as if the storm had polished her rather than harmed her. Pilgrims began to arrive, not in great numbers at first, but quietly, one by one. Travelers passing through heard whispers of a statue that fire could not touch, of a proud man brought to his knees, of a mercy that lingered in stone. They came not for spectacle, but for solace. And at the heart of it all was the Imam. He no longer mocked. He no longer boasted. He spent his mornings sweeping the square, his evenings kneeling beside Marta, helping her light the candles she had once carried alone. He did not call himself changed. He did not preach grand sermons. But when people asked what had happened, he simply lowered his gaze and said, "Mercy found me." The village was no longer the same. The division that once tore it in two began to heal. Those who had scoffed at faith stood now in reverent silence. Those who had been afraid found courage in the glow of candlelight. And Marta, once lonely in her vigil, now found herself surrounded nightly by others, their prayers weaving together in quiet harmony. The statue bore no scars of her fall, no marks of the fire. She stood as she always had, but her story had changed. She was no longer just stone. She was testimony. And the villagers knew they would never forget the night the storm raged, the fire burned, and yet mercy remained untouched. Sometimes, it isn't belief that we choose. Sometimes, it's mercy that chooses us. If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, because the world needs to be reminded that grace can reach anyone.